Hello and welcome to another edition of Storyophonic, a regular conversation series with tips and tales from deep inside the music industry. Please take a moment and rate us or give us a review on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us at storyophonic.com as well as on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Now let's meet the host of Storyophonic, Dan Campbell.
Grammy-winning recording artists, band leaders, record producers, songwriters, recording engineers, film and television production companies, film directors, actors, screenwriters, comedians, visual artists, and book authors. Lawyer Rachel Stilwell represents the legal interests of the Hollywood entertainment industry.
Creative people want to collaborate, and I want to help them get those collaborations done. But I also want them to get paid fairly, and I want them to be able to protect their intellectual property. So it's fun and a nice challenge.
Her clients also include the nonprofit musicFIRST Coalition, and she serves on the board of governors of the Recording Academy's LA chapter and the board of the Future of Music Coalition. And she still made time to talk to us about the vital issues affecting music makers in this modern age on Storyophonic. It is a beautiful Friday morning in Valley Glen, California, and we are here with Rachel Stilwell. Rachel, thank you so much for coming out today.
I am so delighted to be here. Thank you.
Good. It's always so interesting when we have representatives of the legal profession with us because it's a different brain set in order to read and to work in the legal things. So it's fun for me because I get to use parts of my brain that are kind of dusty and rusty. But here's one that I wanted to ask you right off the bat. Sure. I was trying to remember from college, to whom do the airwaves belong?
The airwaves belong to the American public.
That's what I thought.
So we're talking about AM, FM radio
Yes.
airwaves, right? Yep. They are the property of the American public and governed by the Federal Communications Commission, who has a public interest obligation to the American public.
So what is included in that obligation?
The Communications Act of 1934 and several higher court decisions since then have established that the FCC has three touchstones by which they are required to do all of their regulatory actions in the public interest. And those touchstones are localism, competition, and diversity.
Uh-huh. Those are issues now. Those are issues which are, under review, under debate, rather contentious issues at certain times. Let's look at the diversity of ownership
Sure.
of radio stations. And as we've seen with the larger networks, there's a great deal of consolidation happening. I'm from Lima, Ohio, and our local radio station in Lima is now owned by one of those big conglomerates. And so I follow people's conversation back there, and they're saying they don't care about us on a local level anymore. We don't even have local news people anymore. They're not really covering us locally.
Right. Yeah, there's actually a few different types of diversity within the purview of regulating AM/FM radio. One, as you point out, quite aptly, is ownership diversity. And we've found that over the years, as commercial radio has consolidated, there are increasing barriers to entry for, in particular, minorities and women. And it's traditionally difficult for minorities and women to obtain the capital that required in order to invest in that kind of a business, which requires a lot of money. And of course, if you don't have people of color and women who own radio stations, then it's less likely that people who are on the air and music that is played on the air are going to represent the viewpoints of women and people of color. So there's another type of diversity called viewpoint diversity, which is something that the FCC is required to care about and preserve and promote. And right now, that's something that my clients, the Future of Music Coalition and the musicFIRST Coalition, are working hard to make sure that the FCC does what they're supposed to in this regard and doesn't allow that situation to get even worse, which very well might happen if the current proposal by the National Association of Broadcasters, which would allow drastic further deregulation at the local market levels, if enacted, we strongly believe, based on what's happened in prior waves of consolidation, that we could expect viewpoint diversity and ownership diversity to decrease substantially in local markets throughout the entire country.
We've had guests on the show before who've come from the Americana world, and they came back from the Americana conference and were really, bemoaning the lack of female representation in Americana music. And I think in the wider picture, because it is so radio dominant, country music specifically, we are noticing a huge lack of female country artists. Do you think that that's directly related to the diversity ownership issue?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There have been plenty of studies. One gem of a study in particular by Dr. Jada Watson out of the University of Ottawa that studied annual airplay charts for 20 years of commercial country radio stations, and found that steadily since 1998, representation of female artists and songs by female artists have declined precipitously ever since 1998, which pretty much corresponds with the years of consolidation, ownership consolidation that we've seen in AM/FM radio. National consolidation started to really kick off around 1996. And back then, those were the days of Martina McBride and Faith Hill and Reba McEntire and Shania Twain, completely dominating the country airwaves. And then as of 1998 or so, women were just shunned from the airwaves as word got out through country radio programmers that the theory was, and it's not one that we buy into, that country radio listeners are largely women themselves. Mm-hmm. And the idea was they want to hear male voices. They want to hear men who sound like their boyfriends. And in fact, what you're seeing in the press today is a group of amazingly talented female recording artists and songwriters who are saying enough is enough. Our representation on these airwaves have declined year after year, and we hear from our fans and we hear from audiences that women do want to hear women, and we are not buying what we're being told by radio programmers anymore in this regard, and we're fed up. Female listeners are saying, we want to hear women. We want to hear women who sound like us and who care about the things that we care about on the airwaves. We want to hear songs that aren't just about women in shorts with long legs riding in pickup trucks. We are capable of more than that.
Amen to that. We love us some women, Stereophonic. We have featured, many songwriters, many artists, many producers, record executives. And we do see, as you've indicated, a uniting and a positive energy kind of coming together out of some of these conflicts. I mean, hopefully that's the way it is. I mean, are we wearing rose-colored glasses, Rachel, or are things better?
Well, I think that there has to be a day of reckoning with regard to women being represented on country radio. When we did our own original research for our filings with the FCC in this ownership review, we took a look at 22 country stations that had been sold from Citadel Broadcasting to Cumulus back in 2011. So this was one of the more substantial group sales of country radio stations. And we analyzed playlists from these stations for a number of years and found that in 2010, the airplay for women was certainly, not anywhere close to where it had been in 1998. But after the sale of the Citadel stations to Cumulus in 2011, we went a few years further down the line in 2014 and compared the playlists from those 2 years, 2010 and 2014, with the sale being in 2011. And what we found was after that group of 22 stations was sold, the playlists on those stations were contracted greatly. So they cut the number of songs that they were playing substantially overall for both men and women from 2010 to 2014. But for women, the number of songs that were featuring female artists in 2014 were reduced by 40.9% between 2010 and 2014. So you can't say that, the sale of these stations didn't have anything to do with it. I think broadcasters themselves often will say, there's no causal effect. There's just a correlation, and there are lots of reasons why we should, play fewer women. I don't buy that. But in fact, just this last week, there was an interview of the former top execs at Cumulus who ran that entity at the time period that we're talking about. And they're no longer at Cumulus, and so I guess they can afford to be more candid than the rest of the radio industry. But they said flat out, when asked if you could do anything differently during this period of consolidation, ownership consolidation that happened, what would you do differently at Cumulus? And Lou Dickey and John Dickey, who were brothers who were running the joint at the time, Lou said, well, I wouldn't have centralized the programming decisions so much. I would have allowed local program directors to make more programming decisions at the local level. We overdid it and centralized those programming decisions too much. And his brother John said, well, that's all well and good, but because it's so expensive to buy radio stations, we're not going to be seeing any less centralization of programming decisions going forward, because the financial realities are that the entities that buy those stations have to consolidate the jobs, the programming jobs, in a way that allows them to take money out of the radio stations instead of reinvesting it. And so you're going to see a continuation of centralized programming decisions. So what that says to me is, okay, if that's what was going on at Cumulus around the time of this sale, then that was a corporate decision. They couldn't have not known at the very top levels that there were systematic decisions to eliminate women from the country airwaves, and that it wasn't just a response at local levels, that this was a corporate decision. Mm-hmm. As a result of that corporate decision, which is so far permanent, at those Cumulus stations that we studied, the airplay for women never got better. It only got worse. And now it needs to change.
Also, one of the elements that comes up is regionalism in music, where, prior to radio being owned by so few entities, if you listen to a station in Chicago, it was going to sound different musically, right, in terms of musical choices. And, historically, there would be regional artists who would have what they call breakout hits at that time. And then based on, their popularity in one region, they could then go to hopefully a national level. But all of that music sounded a lot different. New Orleans music sounded different than New York music, than Los Angeles music.
Right.
And that's a beautiful thing. That's enriching the musical culture, the textures of that music, and giving us that tapestry.
It is a beautiful thing, but it is in decline, and it's in danger of declining further. So this goes to the localism part of what the FCC is supposed to protect as it decides whether to allow for more deregulation of radio station ownership. And, in 1996, the caps on the number of radio stations that one entity could own throughout the entire country were completely removed. And as most listeners of radio realized, that that allowed entities like Clear Channel, which later became iHeart, and Cumulus and Entercom, to go on a buying spree, go into a lot of debt, fire a lot of people, and replace local broadcasters and local programmers with syndicated programming that is recorded and programmed far, far away from wherever listeners happen to be listening. So that ate up a ton of localism, which is a horrible thing that I wish hadn't happened. So a lot of people are saying, well, how much worse could it get? And the answer is a lot worse. Even though the rules that provided caps on the number of radio stations that one entity can own throughout the country have already been removed completely, there still are, thank goodness, some rules governing the cap, the maximum number of radio stations, AM and FM stations, that can be owned in individual markets. That's what's in danger right now, as the FCC is thinking about and seeking comment from the public on whether they should abide by a request by the National Association of Broadcasters to completely eliminate the currently existing caps on the number of radio stations that can be owned in individual markets for markets in size that are ranked 76 and below. So, in other words, in smaller markets, the FCC would have no problem allowing monopolies in rural areas and smaller markets that depend greatly on AM and FM radio for local music and local news and information. But it also would affect medium and large markets as well. The proposal, if enacted, would allow one entity to own up to 8 radio stations in markets through 1 through 75, and there would be no limitations on how many of those could be AM, how many of those could be FM. And there would, in addition, be exceptions allowing up to 10 stations in given markets if they participated in certain programs that would allow them additional waivers. In many of these markets, that's a lot more stations that can be owned by one entity than is currently allowed. And this thing called the AM/FM subcap, it's basically a rule that says, hey, if you're going to max out the number of radio stations that you own in a given market, you can't have all FM, you can't have all AM. You've got to have some split. And if you already own 8 stations in, like here in Los Angeles, some of them have to be AM. You can't have all FM. And the NAB proposal would eliminate that subcap so that all of a sudden an entity could own up to 10 FM stations in one market, potentially. So if you do that, then you're going to have reduced localism, reduced competition, because you have fewer broadcasters in that market, fewer entities that are owning radio stations in that market. And you're going to have fewer viewpoints on the air, and it's going to be tougher for minorities and female broadcasters to own stations and compete with big, huge cluster entities at a local basis that have all the market share.
We spent a lot of time talking about radio. You know a lot about radio. You also have a background in radio in a completely different way, which is when you were at Verve Records and you were involved in the promotion of music to radio.
That's true. And that's why I'm so passionate about this particular issue, and have been since I was in radio promotion back in the 90s. So I am actually not an FCC lawyer by trade. I am a music lawyer, and I represent artists, I represent songwriters, producers, engineers, and I'm an intellectual property lawyer. But I've always been passionate about deregulation of radio station ownership, because when I was a record promoter prior to becoming an attorney, and I was promoting records for Verve, best job in the world, and at the time, the best label in the world.
Yeah.
You know, it was really a privilege to be there. But I lived through 1996 and the enactment of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I promoted records before, during, and after that happening. And I saw the disastrous effects on radio stations and the people that worked there and then suddenly didn't work there. And massive job layoffs, a disparate effect on people of color and female air talent and programmers, and a change away from localism and pointing to syndicated programming, more research, and less gut, less real programming, and certainly less risk-taking. And it was just less fun, and still is. But there's still hope, right? There are still commercial radio stations, and certainly non-commercial stations out there that are doing great work, who invest in how they sound, who invest in real people. They are live and local, and they're still doing a great job. Those stations tend to be, more often than not, stations that are not owned by big entities that are trying to suck money out of the stations for the benefit of shareholders. They tend to be independent broadcasters who have a really strong relationship with their audience in a local and live way. We want to help make it easier for those kinds of stations to continue to compete at the local levels. And they can't really do that if they're up against these huge clusters that suck up all the market share and are essentially demanding the advertising dollars to go to their big clusters that we'd really like to see go to these independent broadcasters that do such a great job of presenting live and local radio.
We'll be right back after this. At Stereophonic, we are obsessed with great sound. Every episode of our podcast is edited and mixed using the software plugins created by iZotope, the secret weapon of professionals around the world that inspire and enable creativity, save time, increase productivity, and deliver professional sounding results. To find out more, visit iZotope.com. That's spelled I-Z-O-T-O-P-E. And now, back to our podcast. Prior to entering into the music business, prior to entering the legal profession, you have an undergraduate degree in philosophy.
Yes, I do.
And how does that relate to what you do now?
Well, there's a joke among philosophers that there are really only two things that you can do with a philosophy degree. And one of them is teach philosophy, and the other is go into law.
Oh, interesting.
So philosophy is helpful in learning how to argue. And by that, I don't mean learn how to be argumentative. Rather, learning how to write persuasively and speak persuasively, one hopes, anyway. And but so there is a third thing that at the time you could do with a philosophy degree, and that was go into the music business. At that time, it didn't require a whole lot of training. It required a passion for music and a lot of stamina. And I had both of those. But I was always curious. And then 1999 seemed like a really good time to leave the record business, right? Napster hit, consolidation of radio. My job at radio, or in radio promotion, was not as much fun as it was prior to consolidation happening. Brick and mortar retail consolidated as well. And there was less investment being made in A&R at record labels. And so I decided to leave and go finish my undergraduate degree at UCLA here in philosophy. And while I was there, I don't know what I was thinking, but I said, I think I'll go to law school. I thought I was leaving the music business. I thought I was leaving the record business, but I failed at leaving the music business. And now I just do it in a different capacity. Yeah. So while I was in the record business, I always wanted to use a few more brain cells, but it never occurred to me that there could be such a thing as a music attorney. But after I got out of law school, I wound up working at a firm that had a very fine music attorney there who gave me a few things to do. And it came easy because I had worked with artists all of my adult life and knew what they and their managers and their entourage knew what these folks wanted to accomplish from a business standpoint. And so even though at the time I hadn't studied copyright law or trademark law, that came quickly. And I love what I do. I'm not a litigator. I'm a deal maker. And I negotiate and draft deals every day of the week and protect my clients, get them paid, protect their intellectual property. And I absolutely love what I do.
We love hearing that, and that shows that you love what you do.
It's fun. Most people, when they hear about lawyers, think of people who are feisty and suing and argumentative and sometimes jerks. And my experience is I am looking to represent my clients vociferously and take care of them and get them paid. And it's really a privilege to represent them and to have their trust. And I do fight like hell, but most of us in this profession really subscribe to the belief that you don't have to be a jerk in order to do it. You can do so in a polite but firm way.
It's so interesting when I communicate with people who are not in our business and they have these images of the music business being what you just said, just being this scary, cutthroat, you've got to watch everything. I mean, I think the difference is now from when I was coming up that the information is there. If one chooses to get information about how these systems work, there's schools that teach that. There's programs that teach that. There's organizations who have panels and classes and workshops. And so, that I didn't know thing doesn't really work anymore. If you want to know, you can find out a lot of information.
Creative people want to collaborate.
Yeah.
And I want to help them get those collaborations done. But I also want them to get paid fairly, and I want them to be able to protect their intellectual property. So it's fun and a nice challenge.
From your standpoint, how has the shift to streaming changed the landscape for creative people?
Well, people are just making less money from records than they used to. And so that does affect the pocketbooks of my clients, some of whom used to make a lot more money than they do now. But there still is money to be made in music publishing. There's still money to be made in licensing. There's still money to be made in touring. And occasionally, there's still money to be made in records, particularly for those people who are not so risk averse and are willing to be a bit on the entrepreneurial side. It's tough, though, that on-demand streaming has essentially provided such a substitute for record sales, not just because there's less money to be made, although that's just a travesty, but also we used to be able to sell albums, and albums were, works of art. And now everything's singles driven, and there's no changing it. And so we're going to live with it the way that it is. But every once in a while, when somebody makes a great album, I'm sort of wistful about, wouldn't it be great if everybody still strove to create a body of work like that and release it all at one time, rather than just a single here and a single there. At the same time, singles are fun. You hear a catchy tune, you've got access to it. From a consumer standpoint, it's nice to be able to just pick up the one tune that you want to listen to and stream it on demand.
Sure. What kind of projects did you enjoy most at Verve when you were working? Some artists that you worked with that you really enjoyed?
I worked with some amazingly talented musicians: Herbie Hancock, Shirley Horn, Joe Henderson, Roy Hargrove, Christian McBride, who's still kicking, and blues artists, Lucky Peterson, Johnny Clyde Copeland. Smooth jazz was a big thing back then, before it got over-researched and the radio format declined. But I worked with some amazing contemporary jazz and smooth jazz artists: Chris Bodie, Jeff Lorber, Art Porter. I was lucky to have their trust in a different way, take care of them, make sure that they got promoted, that radio stations knew not only what their songs sounded like, but who they were as people. And I went around the country to all kinds of radio stations with Wayne Shorter. I drove McCoy Tyner from New York to Philadelphia to a gig with his big band. And I just did it just because I wanted to spend that kind of time in the car with him. Ostensibly, it was supposed to be for a radio interview at WRTI at Temple University in Philly. But I just wanted to be in a car for a couple hours with McCoy Tyner. It's been a long time, obviously, but I do remember him telling me about almost getting arrested with Art Pepper. I saw a lot of live music. I had my own little table at the Village Vanguard where they knew if I showed up that, that was my table. That was a good time. The 90s were a great time to be working in the record business, particularly at a label like that with such amazing music. But I also, they gave me an expense account and said, go travel the country and talk about how great our stuff is. I'm like, yeah, okay, I could do that.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, Verve is now part of Universal Music, correct?
It is.
Yes. So more consolidation, a little more consolidation.
Well, a lot more consolidation,
Yeah.
and many different regimes there, many different leaders over the years since I departed in 1999. I, along with everybody else, read a recent New York Times article by Jody Rosen that talked about the fire that destroyed thousands upon thousands of master tapes that were housed at a facility on the Universal Studios lot. And I remember the fire, but I had no idea that that's where so much of the master recordings that were owned by Universal were housed. And I had no idea that the fire destroyed all of those masters. And the majority of what I did at Verve involved new artists, but we put out amazing box sets from Clifford Brown and Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, and I had a relationship to that catalog. And when I read that article, I cried. It was devastating to find out only now that this fire in 2008 destroyed these master recordings that not only owned by Verve, all kinds of labels, but that was my home, and I was loyal, and I loved my job, and I loved the music, new and old. Now that it's been a number of years since I worked there, the stuff that I worked on that was new is now cataloged, but how much of that was destroyed in that fire, and why did Universal keep it quiet?
How do they keep it quiet? That's what I think is fascinating. I mean, because this is a town where there aren't many secrets like that. And that's a huge thing.
It is a huge thing.
Yeah.
I wasn't there, so I can't speak for I can't speak for them. But what a tragedy.
Yeah. I love the artists that you just referenced. It's interesting. Somebody like Joe Henderson, who so revolutionary, his contributions musically. He's from my hometown. So oddly enough, we didn't know that growing up. It was only later I found out he was from my hometown.
An amazing player, but a wonderful, warm, soft-spoken, kind human being. And I miss him a lot.
Yes. It's so interesting when you talk about A&R. I recently read an article, I think it was in Billboard this week, I was talking about how there's now an influx of new funds coming to A&R. There's actually a lot of signings that are happening. Does that make sense to you on some level, that there are a lot of artists that are being signed? I'm not really sure what the approach is and why they're being signed.
I didn't read the article.
Yeah.
The question is, what kind of deals are they getting?
Yeah.
Are they getting 360 deals that take revenue out of their pockets in many areas other than just recording? Frankly, not all 360 deals are alike. If a label really is investing in your career as an artist and isn't just paying lip service to that idea, then doing some revenue share might in certain instances make sense.
For those listeners who are not familiar with 360 deals, those are what you just said. There are opportunities for labels to share in revenue from things that aren't necessarily record sales. It could be touring, it could be merchandising, it could be sync uses. It just obviously they already got sync uses, but just other things other than just selling records.
Right, endorsement deals.
Endorsement deals, right.
Any kind of revenue they can get their hands on. So artists tend to try to avoid those types of deals and provide rights only to the sound recording.
This is an international business, so to be in the modern music business requires knowledge of how international revenues work as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And the United States is still the largest, as I believe, market for recorded music still. Is
True.
that correct?
Yep.
Okay, cool. What are some of the considerations that an artist today coming up, like say going into an initial record deal, would need to be aware of that's different than it would have been in the past?
Well, record deals are not all the same. I mean, it used to be that your standard recording agreement would come from a major record label. They would own the master recording. Mm-hmm. They would provide some kind of advance that would be used in part to fund the recording session and in part to go in the pocket of the artist. And then there would be some sort of artist royalty that would provide the recording artist a revenue stream going forward that was fairly dependable. These days, however, not every record deal is alike. Many artists are putting out their own records. Many artists are doing distribution deals. Many artists are doing deals with indie record labels where they can specify more about what they want in those deals. An indie label may not have the leverage that a major label can have because the major label has so much power in its distribution arm. But with indie labels, they can be potentially more agile. And remarkably, independent labels these days make up a fair amount of the market share in revenue across the board. So I think the last time I heard, 34% of market share revenue was attributable to independent record labels combined. And so I'm having more of my clients say that they're interested in being on an indie label because they have a closer connection with the A&R people there and more flexibility in terms of collaborating with the label to figure out how to market their work. It's harder to get on the radio now, AM/FM radio, due to consolidation. Yeah. And so if that's not going to happen anyway, and you want to promote your music through streaming platforms and you want help with tour support, if you want to be creative in your online promotion, then you might do that with an indie. So while I still have plenty of clients who say, I'd like to be on a major label because they have a lot of muscle, many artists are just eschewing that idea altogether and either putting out records themselves and making money on it because they don't, because they get to keep the net profits, or they'll decide that they want to pair up with an indie and do a more custom deal and a more custom marketing plan.
I think that's interesting how big the market share actually is. It's also interesting to think that what we know as major labels now, at one time were indie labels. You know what I mean? Motown was an indie label. Atlantic was an indie label.
Right.
They all started kind of in that place.
And then they all got consolidated too.
There's a lot of that going around. So you work with the musicFIRST Coalition.
I do.
That's a number of organizations under the umbrella of that. Very influential organizations as well, the Recording Academy being one.
I'm very privileged to have musicFIRST as a client. They're a membership organization comprised of entities like the Recording Academy, the Latin Recording Academy, the RIAA, A2IM, which is the Coalition of Independent Labels, Sound Exchange, the AFM, SAG-AFTRA, Christian Music Trade Organization, the Rhythm and Blues Foundation, and many other just stellar organizations. And I'm excited that I and my partner at Future of Music Coalition, Kevin Erickson, were able to convince the musicFIRST Coalition to really get down deep into the issue of potentially further deregulation at AM/FM radio. musicFIRST has been known primarily for its wonderful work advocating for recording artists and labels, advocating for fair pay for the use of sound recordings at AM/FM radio. So working with them on this other issue related to the FCC ownership review of AM/FM radio was a new thing for them. So it was fun that I was able to bring this thing that I'm passionate about to them, and them to say, yep, we're going to sign on and you're going to be the person to do it.
It's a mighty powerful coalition of organizations with a huge diversity.
It is. Talking about diversity, one thing that's interesting about the comments that were filed and reply comments that were filed in this proceeding with the FCC is that even though the National Association of Broadcasters purports to represent AM/FM radio stations across the country, really that whole industry is incredibly divided on whether they think it's a good idea to deregulate or not. There were a lot of really diverse radio entities that filed comments and reply comments against deregulation. So really strange, interesting bedfellows. You had Urban One, which owns Radio One, which is primarily urban R&B, hip hop, gospel, and they're proud to serve largely an African American audience. And then, and they said they were very much against further deregulation and that would hurt minority broadcasters in particular. Then you also had Salem Media, which is primarily comprised of conservative talk radio and Christian radio, both Christian talk and Christian music, also weighing in on this issue, saying that they were against deregulation as well. And their theory was, hey, we own a lot of AM properties. If you do this deregulation, it's going to completely devalue AM radio, and we're going to be stuck holding the bag. We've really invested in AM because that works for us with these formats, and we are not interested in having more deregulation of AM/FM radio. Their conservative talk radio host, Hugh Hewitt, put in his own letter saying this idea of the National Association of Broadcasters to further deregulate ownership of radio is crazy. And it's going to be harmful to radio. It's going to be harmful to listeners. And so it's really a bipartisan issue, right? So whether you lean left or you lean right, there are plenty of broadcasters on both sides of that say further consolidation is not the answer. That's not what we need. That would harm listeners.
I will think of you as I listen to the radio today, Rachel Stilwell.
Thank you.
A couple stereophonic questions for
Sure.
you, if we will. You obviously worked, as you referenced, in the record business before you came up. What music inspired you when you were growing up to want to be in the business, or at least to know about the business?
I think the first time I thought about getting into the music business, I was listening to Les McCann and Eddie Harris' Swiss Movement. And it was a vinyl record of my dad's, and I listened to Compared to What. And I loved the song. It was the funkiest, jazziest thing with so much emotion, but the lyrical content was so compelling and so powerful, and it told such an important story and such an important viewpoint. And it was a protest song. And I thought, I want to be a part of this. This is something that is good for people to hear, and I want to help them hear it. There weren't a whole lot of 18-year-olds back in the 1980s listening to Les McCann and Eddie Harris Compared to What. But that's who I was, and I got passionate about it. And of course, there are lots of people who are passionate about music. But like everybody else in the music business, I am a frustrated musician. Yeah. And so I started my collegiate career with a major in vocal performance. And then at some point I realized, sometime quickly actually, I realized that I was much smarter than I was talented. And that my skill set at the time would be better served to promoting music than singing it.
I love it. That's great.
So I got an internship in 1988 for Ricky Schultz at MCA Jazz and never looked back.
Question, kind of illegal sort of question for some of our listeners who might not quite be clear on this. Rachel, what is the difference between a copyright and a trademark?
Okay. Well, they have two different purposes. So a copyright is a form of intellectual property that is meant to protect the creator, right? So the idea is the creator makes something, it's valuable, it's property, and you want to be able to protect it and not have it infringed upon, and you want to be able to license it. A trademark is actually about protecting the consumer. So with a trademark or a brand, a mark that identifies the source of goods or services, it's about making sure that if a consumer sees that mark and associates it with a service or a good or a band, that they know that it's the real thing, and that it's not a substitute. So copyright, essentially, you're taking ideas and you're fixing them into some kind of form, whether it's a sound recording or musical notes on a page or text. And with the trademark, it can be words or it can be a logo, but it identifies the source of goods or services. And in the context in which I work, often that means things like band names.
Band names.
Band
There
names.
you go. That's why we have you. Rachel Stilwell, you're lovely. I learned a lot from researching you, and I learned a lot today in this conversation. And, as they say, the beat goes on.
It does. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. This episode of Stereophonic was produced and edited by Lindsay Tomasic. Our theme music was written and produced by Dusty Gray.